is the time for us to stand up together as one.
Okay, so Transformers 1. I really didn't want to make this video. I just wanted to let this movie go, to not let it bother me, to ignore it and act like it never happened. But then the trending started. When I searched on YouTube for this movie, I did not find a single negative review video aside from that IGN one that everyone keeps making fun of. But wait, before you leave, let me just say something you can agree with. This movie doesn't have a lot of depth. It really doesn't have time to have any depth because, like most American movies, there are so many action scenes to keep the audience's attention that you really don't have time to explore characters very much, or their motivations, or the themes of the story. It all kind of gets brushed aside quickly. But really, I would have been able to stomach the movie just fine if that had been all it was. If it had been like a mediocre impression on people, if it had been received as an average movie, I wouldn't have cared. But it got a really positive reception online, especially, and even on Rotten Tomatoes. People on YouTube could not stop cursing about how great this movie was and how it is the best Transformers movie to ever happen ever. And yeah, if it weren't for 1986, that would probably be a true statement. Now, for over a decade, the live-action Transformers movies really haven't been trying to be good stories. They're more about keeping your attention with lots of unique action and objectifying women. So they aren't really trying to be very good from a story perspective. So yes, you could say that Transformers 1 is better than those. Being the best of the worst isn't really that much of an achievement, especially when this movie also falls victim to a lot of other Hollywood pitfalls. But again, the same sort of principle applies here. If the characters in the movies have been bad for the last decade, then of course we're going to react well to a film that portrays them as more likable. Because Transformers 1 does seem really good when compared to the live-action movies, but when it's put up against 2010's Transformers Prime, or even 2022's Transformers Earthspark, the praise doesn't seem quite so justified. And I think that the way previous media handles the characters is a bit more respectful. Like, I really appreciate the aligned version of Orion Pax because he's so innocent. He makes friends with Megatron, but they don't really understand each other. And Orion is, quick to trust him because he's sort of naive. He doesn't really know how dark things can get. But in Transformers 1, Orion Pax isn't really innocent at all. I can understand wanting to make Orion more relatable, and make him do relatable things like flip people off at work and refuse to apologize to his friend after immature pranks. Really, a character like that is much too innocent to be the main character of a Hollywood production. Especially not an action comedy film. Fans have long praised Peter Cullen for talking about the ideals of being strong enough to be gentle. Optimus Prime is supposed to embody those ideals, but the character in Transformers 1 doesn't strike you as a gentle character. Orion, for the majority of the movie, comes across as an ordinary American film protagonist. Sometimes he's funny, sometimes he's vulgar, sometimes he's cocky, sometimes he's nice. It's really nothing special. You can probably see where I'm going with this. It's because the characters are so shallow that I can't really care about any part of the story. I think the other big factor that just detaches me from the story entirely is the tone. Because it's one thing for a film to balance jokes with drama. There are plenty of films that do that really well, but the first half of Transformers 1 reads as a very shallow kids' comedy that is also kind of foul sometimes, and really doesn't have much narrative weight at all. But the second half of the movie is very dark and serious and takes itself very seriously, and tries hard to be dramatic. So it sort of feels like two different stories were sort of put together. I think the best way to summarize the issues with Transformers 1 for me is that it's a tragedy that was taken over by comedy. It keeps you from appreciating the tragic elements of the story because it's so loud and distracting in its other parts. And the comedy in the film really isn't that good because it's mostly focused on being unexpected and out of pocket, rather than being clever and well-timed. It works well for clickbait, but not really for a movie that you can watch many times. And I feel that the character that suffers most from this overshadowing of the tragedy is Megatron, because D16 as a character just doesn't have much depth in this film. If you're going to describe his character arc and the factors of the story that motivated it, it sounds kind of ridiculous to explain it. The film presents that the turning point is when he discovers that all the populace are being deceived by their leader, but really it's not like D16 was suffering all that much personally from Sentinel's rule and from the limitations he imposed on people. He killed a few primes that D16 never actually met, and he locked them into their jobs and took away their transformation and gave away a lot of their energon. But if you look at the first half of the film, it really doesn't seem like he and Orion and the others are really suffering all that much. They're basically just working low-income jobs. And once he discovers that Sentinel's been lying to them, it just comes across as strange that he would change so much on a dime, because he suddenly hates Sentinel so much that he wants to kill him himself. And when you compare that story to the Prime version of Megatron, who was fighting for his life in the arena and killing in order to survive, the motivation seems pretty weak. Honestly, the whole setup of the oppression of the masses in Transformers 1 is very weak because it just isn't very serious. Now, could D16 have suffered more on a personal level prior to these events? Yes, but the film never shows it. It never makes that stuff relevant, so it doesn't make the plot work any better. I can see why a lot of people appreciate the tragic angle that this movie takes. By the end of the film, it is clear where Optimus and Megatron stand and the morals that they have. But the biggest problem is that we don't know why they stand where they stand. There's never a moment in the story where Orion is inspired to believe that peace is the only way, that acts as an inciting incident. There's no explanation as to why he feels so strongly about that. And there's no real suffering to give any weight and reason for D16's decision to take justice and revenge into his own hands. The impression that the film leaves you with by the end is that D16 is angry because he's an angry guy, and Optimus becomes a hero because he's a nice guy, and you never really learn why they are the way that they are. The characters have no history. Optimus Prime has always stood for heroic values like freedom and compassion, and this story would have been the perfect opportunity to show where he learned those ideals from. The story can't just focus on how he thought the Primes were cool and wanted to be a hero like them. because that doesn't teach you what a hero actually is. We see the origin of Orion Pax and D16 as characters, but we don't see the origin of their core values. And so what you're left with are really shallow characters. Now, I do really appreciate Transformers 1 for its concepts of these characters, how that desire for revenge can go too far. And I really appreciate how this story places emphasis on the tragic friendship of Orion and D16. The dynamic between them that the film is aiming to establish is pretty good, that the story is built on good foundations. It's just that there isn't any time in this movie to properly explore any of them. And the movie doesn't make good use of the time that it does have because it keeps getting distracted by comedy and action. And if you're any character in this movie other than Orion Pax or Megatron, you really don't get the chance to have any depth at all. You're basically just a trope character. And yeah, all my problems with this movie are in the execution. If Transformers 1 had been a limited Netflix series with a different cast and creative team, and they had more time to flesh out the ideas, I'm sure I would have loved it. The plot itself wouldn't even really need to change, it's just that they would have more time to actually explore the characters and the themes present in the story. But what we got instead was extremely rushed and disrespectful. And yeah, if it's not clear by now, the issue I keep circling back to is character building. Transformers 1 does not prioritize character building. So there isn't any depth here, it's just the illusion of depth. And it gets pretty frustrating attempting to engage with people with their opinions on the movie, because their praise of the film becomes really shallow really fast. People will say things like, well, it was so deep and emotional, and then I'll say, well, it wasn't very emotional, there wasn't much depth to the emotional payoff, here's why. And then they'll say, well, yeah, but it's okay because it was so funny. It's not really, it doesn't have to be that deep. And then I'll say, but it really wasn't that funny. It was more so just out of pocket and unexpected with its comedy. Here's why. And I'll give some examples. And then they'll say, well, yeah, but it's so deep, you know? And there's like famous people in it. Now, what I think is maybe that people just think it's a really pretty movie visually, and it does some really bold stuff with its story and dialogue. It feels like something fresh and new, and I will say the animation is pretty fresh, and the highlighting of a corruption arc, a character that starts out good and becomes bad, you don't often see that in cinema. But aside from that, there's really nothing fresh about it, because, as I've been saying, it kind of hits every pitfall of modern American cinema. Now, I have heard reviewers say that the pacing of the movie is a little hard to deal with, how it moves through things so quickly, and I've talked about that. But I think people don't often touch on the tone of the film. Tone is a difficult thing to balance in storytelling. And the thing about Transformers 1 is that it jumps so hard between dark and silly tones that it's very jarring. Because by the end of Transformers 1, it's clear that they really want to touch on dark themes and tragedy of a broken friendship. But in the earlier parts of the movie, there were so many scenes where the film just does not take itself seriously in the slightest. Like, basically every scene with B. It's really emotionally confusing when you're introduced to characters like Starscream and Elita, and they're introduced as jokes, basically, and they spend nearly the whole first half of the movie just being jokes, and then in the last part of the movie they become very serious and they're used in dramatic roles. Now, of course, the climax of any story has got to be more intense than the previous parts, but with this story, it feels like it was setting up more of a comedic kind of climax instead of one that becomes very serious and very tragic. You can't really expect the audience to get very invested in the tragedy when it's both rushed and they're also distracted by a lot of loud comedy. And that's something that reviewers almost always brush past quickly. Even if the film were paced really well, and the tragedy was really earned and set up really well, and the characters had a lot of depth, and all of it was executed brilliantly, it would still be very hard to take the film's story seriously when they're juggling so many goofy jokes in the same plot. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is something that's harder to say and harder for viewers to hear. I'm gonna have to get into personal stuff for a little bit here. I'm sure that's okay, and I'm sure that you guys will be understanding and nice. Thank you. There's a long story, but basically I'm really sensitive to foul language. I experienced a lot of trauma previously in my life from profanity, and so now it's a very triggering thing for me. Makes me very depressed and anxious whenever I hear it in any form, whether it's media or conversation. As a result, the internet is not a very welcoming place for me. But I do thrive on PG media that does not have any foul language. I greatly enjoy it and I love to analyze it. But in recent years, there have been some very successful animated films that were rated PG, but still included profanity, thinking primarily of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, and Mutant Mayhem, and Across the Spider-Verse. Those all fall into that category, along with Transformers 1. They're all rated PG and marketed as PG, but still include cursing, which is very depressing for me because now it feels like no movie is safe, no matter what it's rated. And I'm invested in this because of myself, not because I have kids that I don't want them to learn to curse. It's something for me where I hate it. It's not that everyone needs to hate it. I know that isn't going to happen, but it was nice that I could at least feel safe in some contexts in media. And yes, I am a pretty rare case where I take it more seriously than most, but I'm not the only one who hates foul language in the audience, which is really kind of a larger issue with media in general. But let's stay focused on this movie. So, if you're going to enjoy profanity so much in your PG cartoon movie that your main character flips off the camera and another main character has cursing as part of his nickname is a curse word. Try to put yourself in my shoes just a little bit here. Are you not a little bit insulted by that? A little, maybe? Is it not the slightest bit disrespectful? Including things like this is going to hurt people's feelings. It's not that it might hurt people, it will hurt people. And if you put it in, then you just don't care. And yeah, I know that they're doing it for the sake of clickbait, but it's working. We're clicking on it. We're making it profitable by clicking on it. So that's not good. So yeah, it isn't really a surprise that it caught on so quickly. Transformers 1 is written to be shocking and clickbait. It's designed to get your attention by any means necessary, and I don't see any value behind that. And the fact that we've all sort of learned to accept inflammatory and insulting behavior online, it doesn't make it right. We know that, right? We know that it's not a good thing, right? We aren't actually trying to offend people all the time, right? Right? And while you can look at comedy movies by DreamWorks in previous decades where they would be subtle and they would hint at adult jokes, and put in lines that would go over the kids' heads.
And we all know nukes ain't an option.
Sure they are. I just,
No!
But if you look at Transformers 1, at the finger scene, is there a single kid in the theater who doesn't know what they're trying to do? It's not subtle, it's incredibly obvious. And is that funny? I just can't look at a PG movie that includes something like that and justify calling it a masterpiece. It feels really disingenuous. I hope I've made it clear how I really wanted to like Transformers 1, and it had some really amazing concepts. The ideas of Orion and D16 really trying to understand each other but tragically failing. The examination of what it truly means to be a prime, of the ideals that you have to have. This movie really had the right ideas, it just failed in the execution, like so many other stories. I think most of all, this movie is defined by its limitations, the limitations that the film industry placed on it, where it had to be PG because it's a animated cartoon movie and had to appeal to kids, and it had to be a certain length or people would get bored, and it had to have a lot of celebrities in it or no one would watch it, and it had to keep moving quickly or it would lose people's attention. It had to have cursing because Hollywood writers can't write without cursing. And it's for all of those reasons that I feel that Transformers 1 doesn't deserve as much praise as it's getting online. But for better or for worse, this is the type of content that we as a society are asking for. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way. Hello? Anybody, is anyone here? No? It's just me here at the end of the video. No one else made it? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I guess that figures. Bye.